Good evening and welcome to Bleak, or whatever time of day it is when you are listening. This week we are going to cover the murder of Sonya Ivanoff, an indigenous woman who was murdered in 2003. Amanda will be reviewing this case, and here we go. Things are gonna get bleak. Bleak. Okay, take it away, Amanda.
Okay, so as Laura said in our intro, we're covering the murder of Sonya Ivanoff, and I have wanted to cover a missing and or murdered indigenous woman for quite some time because it is a very big crisis, as they would say.
Yes.
In terms of the statistics in especially America in particular.
And we both have husbands with indigenous ancestry.
That is true.
Yes.
My husband is about 11%, actually.
Yes. My husband is, I don't really know 100% for sure.
Well, Zoe, on her ancestry, Zoe is Laura's daughter, is about 5%.
So he's probably
on
10%?
par. Yep.
Yeah,
about the same.
something like that.
Alan.
I don't know.
So anyhow, we ourselves are not indigenous in any way.
No.
But our husbands are and our children are
Right.
a little bit. So, and I'm just going to say this now. For some reason, I get the word indigent and indigenous mixed up.
Oh.
Which isn't good
It
because
is not.
Indigent is not a very nice term. Now, the reason, so there's a movie in the 90s called The Client. It was a John Grisham film.
Yes.
And I loved it. It was one of my favorite. I always loved courtroom stuff. Even from the time I was a young kid, I've always liked this kind of stuff.
Yes.
And, sorry if I bumped the microphone. And in that movie, he refers to the little boy and his mom as being indigent. And so for whatever reason, that term has always been ingrained in my head. So I try not to offend anybody.
Right.
So hopefully I don't slip and say that by accident.
If you do, you shall delete that because that would be very unkind.
That's true. So yeah, I guess it's probably a non-issue. I did actually talk to somebody I know, a Native American woman, and I said, I'm going to be doing this podcast. Do you have a problem with being referenced? Because there's a lot of different references. There's Native American, there's Native, there's Indigenous, there's Native Alaska, which obviously would only apply to Alaska Native, or Alaska Native. And she basically said any of the terms I just mentioned would be fine in her book.
Right.
So, I apologize if there's a, more up-to-date reference, but my goal is never to offend anybody.
Right.
So with that being said, just before I get into the case, real quick, I just want to talk about some of the statistics regarding indigenous people and specifically women. So 2% of the American population is indigenous people. So you can deduce that about 1% is indigenous women in particular.
Right. Give or take.
90% of American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced some type of violence in their life.
Oh, that's a high statistic.
And so the most striking statistic that I think kind of just says it all, and I got a lot of these from Minnesota because that's where we live, but I think a lot of these, what applies to Minnesota applies to the country, really. I mean, it's kind of across the board.
Right.
So they make up indigenous women make up 1% of the population, but they are 8% of all murdered women.
Yeah, that's...
So if you look at what the statistic...
Disproportionate.
Right, exactly. Yeah. What should the statistic be? Obviously there shouldn't be a murder statistic at all, but that's the world we live in.
Right.
So if there were no biases or stereotypes, that statistic should be about 1%, right?
Right.
But it's 8%. It's 8 times higher than what it quote-unquote should be. That's just trying to wrap your brain around that. It's striking.
It is.
It just gives you an idea of how that population is seen in our society, and it's just awful. And then another thing I ran across, so some of these are from a few years back because the statistics take years to come out. And then there's issues with people that there's not enough people like researching what's actually going on because there's just a disregard in general.
Right.
But so in 2016, there were 5,712 reports of, this is just in Minnesota, of missing, or no, I'm sorry, in the United States, of missing American Indian and American Native girls, or Alaska Native, sorry. And so when someone is missing, they present it to like a district attorney or a prosecutor.
Yep.
And in 67% of the cases presented to prosecutors, they opted not to prosecute.
Oh.
So that's a huge issue too, because when they do report it, the likelihood that something's going to come of it, that it's going to result in a conviction of somebody, a perpetrator, is very slim.
Right.
So then that perpetuates it worse, because then you have these people that are committing these crimes, they know this. I mean, they might not know that statistic exactly, but they know that they're likely
to get away with
exactly
it.
And that's a huge part of the problem. And especially in terms of like sexual abuse and sexual assault, it's going unreported for this reason.
Well, because the victims also know that likely nothing's going to come of it, and then they're going to have to live with this person in their world, you know what I mean? So if they report it, so
it's a risk.
Very sad. It's
a risk for them too.
Yeah, it's a risk to report it.
So some of the stereotypes, unfortunately, lazy, drug addicted, alcoholic, and that's part of the reason that unfortunately that stereotype leads to people seeing them as throwaways, and we could have a whole episode about just this part of it, just the statistical part of it. So, I'm not going to go on and on forever, but another thing I came across, and this will be like the last statistical thing I'll talk about, is so when you talk about, alcoholism within Native American communities, a lot of people, unfortunately, yes, there is a higher rate of alcoholism, but a big part of the reason is because, and I actually took a screenshot of what so there's a chemical in our blood that breaks down alcohol, and Native American people biologically have little to none of that particular chemical. So what happens is there's a biological reason behind the fact that they have a higher rate of alcoholism.
Right.
And so really what, they need mental health care, they need addiction care, they need that. And instead of that, they're just getting seen as being bad people, and the stereotype gets perpetuated. And it's literally caused by something biological that they have no control over.
Right.
And so then the increased rate of, so if, for example, a white person has 2 beers, they might not feel anything. A Native American has 2 beers, and they might be falling down, stumbling drunk.
Right.
And it's because of the way that their bodies are wired, unfortunately.
Right.
And so
it's a different,
that
like
plays
some
a
kind
huge
of metabolic.
Yeah, it's a metabolic pathway that unfortunately is different.
Right.
And so then that leads, they have, a high risk of diabetes, kidney disease, liver disease. And so these reservations end up in these like horrible states because nobody is helping them appropriately.
Right.
And that's playing a huge role in the problem. So I'm not trying to be insulting. I'm just talking about like something that they completely have no control over.
Right.
And so anyway, we could, like I said, we could have a whole show on that, but That's just some of the stuff I came across when, statistics about indigenous people and women in particular. So we can start the case. So again, this is the murder of Sonya Ivanoff, and this actually takes place in Nome, Alaska. So a couple things about Nome. It's a couple of degrees south of the Arctic Circle. It's a very, weather there is really harsh, gray, gloomy. It's Alaska. Right. Their town slogan is "There's no place like Nome." And just for some perspective, it's closer to Russia than to the rest of the U.S.
Right.
So it's, it's remote.
Remote.
Population,
Isolated.
I don't know if this was at the time of her homicide or currently, but I have is 3,800.
Okay.
So by our standards, that's a small town.
Right.
But by Alaska standards, it's actually not.
A big town.
It's like a city for them.
Right.
So Sonya was only 19 years old when she was murdered. She was basically, she had graduated high school, and she was in Nome trying to make money because she did want to attend college.
Oh, sure.
She eventually wanted to move somewhere warmer. So her best friend was a girl named Timmery.
Okay.
And Timmery is also an Alaska Native woman.
Okay.
And they said they wanted to move to Hilo, Hawaii.
Well, that sounds delightful.
Yep, that's where that was their goal, was to get to Hilo, Hawaii.
Yeah.
She called it Hawaii, and at first I'm like, Hawaii? And then I'm like, oh, Hawaii, duh.
Hawaii.
Like,
some people do call it, like, Hawaii.
Well, it kind of makes sense because of the way it's spelt.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean,
and maybe that is
she might be
right
correct.
Right.
I could be wrong, and she's correct.
Yeah, I don't know.
So they were both, Timmery and Sonya were both from a town in Alaska called Unalakleet. Unalakleet.
Oh, okay.
And it's, Unalakleet is 50 miles southeast of Nome.
Oh. So really in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
Type of
As a matter of fact, to get from Unalakleet to Nome, there are no roads.
How do you get there?
You'd have to fly.
Or
snowmobile. We call it snowmobiling. They call it snow machines.
Snow machines. And what was really funny about the word snow machine? I have to say this.
Yeah, go for it.
So back when I worked for a banking organization, we used to get calls in all the time from Alaska, and they would talk about their loans or whatever, and their snow machines, and in my head I'm picturing all these people with machines that create snow. Like, that's what I was thinking a snow machine was, and I kept thinking, why in Alaska would you need all these snow machines? But it turns out they were all snowmobiles.
Yeah, so. I don't think a lot of states call them snowmobiles, but that's how we live in Minnesota, as we've said 100 times, and that's how I've always heard them referred to.
Snowmobiles.
Until I started watching something on TV, and they said snow machine, and I'm like, what's a snow machine? Because it sounds like a ski resort would use a snow machine to produce snow for their ski hills.
That's what I was thinking. Like, why? And I kept thinking, geez, everyone has a snow machine in Alaska? I kept thinking that's really weird.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, but now, once I found out they were snowmobiles, it really clicked for me.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
So anyway, Sonya was the fourth born of 6 children. And it seemed like of all her siblings, she was very close to her older sister, Christina.
Oh, okay.
Christina's been interviewed a lot in the coverage of this case. She seems like a lovely, lovely lady.
Yeah.
And just a little more background on Sonya. She was so she participated in this Arctic Native Brotherhood pageant, which is not like a typical beauty pageant. It's something she did to make money for college. So
sure.
I don't know if it involves archery and different wildlife skills.
Oh, sure.
And she was working at the admitting desk at the local hospital in Nome, and she was working overnight shifts.
Okay.
So she moved down to Nome, and then her best friend Timmery ended up leaving Unalakleet and also moved to Nome to become roommates with Sonya.
Okay.
So the two of them they showed the place they were living in. I don't know if it was like maybe it was very modest, like a duplex maybe.
Oh, sure.
Or an apartment, but it looked to me like a house that maybe was divided into multiple
units
apartments or something. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Neither of them had a vehicle, which wasn't super uncommon in Nome because it's not a big, in terms of like the square mileage of the town itself, it's a place you can easily walk around
Right.
to the various establishments.
Right.
And they all reported in the research I did that they felt really safe, walking in Nome even at night.
Right. So it was a pretty safe type community.
Yes. And so Christina, which is Sonya's sister, is married to a white man named Tom, so that would be her brother-in-law.
Okay.
And her brother-in-law said, the crisis amongst, missing and indigenous women was something he worried about and thought about. But he said, and he even said something to Sonya about, because they were living in Unalakleet, and then he knew she was moving.
Right.
So, of course, he was concerned about, wanting her to be safe. Because he was like, I won't even know. He goes, if something did happen to you, I wouldn't even know who you're hanging out with or anything. And so he tried to kind of warn her, but she kind of didn't feel like, she just didn't, it wasn't at the forefront of her mind.
Right. It's a town of 3,800. It's not like she's moving to New York City.
Yes.
But it is I don't know. For them, it's a big change.
Yeah. So, just kind of getting into the time right around her disappearance happened. So, like, the day before she disappeared, Timmery and Sonya went to a friend's house and they were playing board games, and they didn't go till like 11 p.m.
Oh, okay.
Now, this happened to be on a Sunday night. However, Sonya did not have to work on Monday.
Okay.
And she actually did not need to have to work until Tuesday at like 3 p.m. or 5 p.m., sometime in the evening.
Oh, sure.
So, even though,
it was like her weekend.
Yeah, she worked at a hospital, so she had an odd schedule.
Right.
So the sun does not set until around midnight in Alaska at that time.
Right.
So, like, this is summertime in Alaska in 2003.
Okay.
So at 1 a.m. on Monday morning, so Sunday night into Monday morning, Timmery, for some reason, decided to go sleep at a friend's house. So they're at a friend's house playing board games.
Yeah.
Sonya was saying she wanted to leave, not because anything was going wrong. She just wanted to go.
Right.
And Timmery was
late.
Yeah. Timmery was like, I'm going to sleep at a friend's house, but because she had to work at 6 a.m.
Oh, okay.
So
she was going to be up in 5 hours.
Right. Because this part to me is a little strange because
I do find that
she wanted to go to a friend's house, because we come to find out she actually ended up going back to their apartment in the morning before she went to work to like get ready.
Was this a male friend?
They didn't get into that at all, so
okay.
I really don't know.
Really
it ends up not really being pertinent anyways, but
okay.
it just was a little strange.
Yeah,
so
interesting.
Sonya and Timmery were walking outside, and then so Timmery was going to go to this friend's house, and Sonya didn't really say where she was going, but she was walking towards their house.
Right.
So I think Timmery just assumed she was probably just going home.
Right.
So Timmery and her had to part ways because they were going like opposite directions.
Right.
So she said they had this little handshake that they did, and they kind of said something like along the lines of "peace out,"
right?
And that was like their little
later.
thing. And then
okay.
So they part ways, and she said, she sees Sonya kind of walking towards their house.
Right.
But never said explicitly where she was going.
Right.
So Timmery stops home at 5 a.m. to get ready for work. Now, I would imagine that would be because, like, her products are there. Like, if she wears makeup, maybe she needed to change clothes.
Right.
So, I guess, I mean, in that sense...
A fresh slather of deodorant.
Yep.
You know?
That makes sense in that regard.
Yes.
But it kind of... I just thought that was a little strange. Like, why would... I don't know, to me, like, why wouldn't you go get that the night before, or...
Yeah,
but whatever.
But it does kind of make sense to me.
I mean, it's not incriminating.
Especially if it was a male friend. I mean, not male necessarily, but you know what I mean? Like
that might have been why she didn't want to get into
right,
it.
Right,
yeah.
But, you know, if it was a romantic friend and then you, you know, in the morning you need to fresh up.
Yeah.
You know, you can't just go to work that way, you know, the way that you were the night before. I mean, that makes sense to me.
No, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And she had a 6 a.m. shift, no, she referring to Timmery, at the Aurora Inn, so one of the local hotels.
Oh, sure.
So Timmery did not hear from Sonya at work that day, but she wasn't alarmed by that because sometimes she would hear from her and sometimes she wouldn't, so not a big deal.
Right, they're young,
they're 19.
Right.
So Timmery did call Sonya's sister, and once she got home from work, because she was like still not super concerned, but she just was like curious if she had seen her, and she had not, or heard from her rather, because her sister's in Unalakleet.
Right.
And she said, you know, I haven't, but they all knew she didn't work until Tuesday afternoon.
Right.
So they were at that point. They're like, oh, she probably just went to somebody else's house.
Right.
But then once evening came, you know, Timmery became more concerned because, and she said this was a huge deal in her mind, she never stopped at home to get, like, all her, like, cosmetics were, she could tell hadn't been used. Right. And apparently she was one of those people that always had to have her hair done, always had to have her makeup done, and she wouldn't just be, like, walking around without any of that. And she said that was actually the biggest red flag for her.
Yeah.
So, so at this point she hadn't missed work yet, though.
Okay.
So on Tuesday around noon, so Timmery hasn't seen her now all day Monday. So she goes back to work again on Tuesday. And now that since Sonya never came home that previous night, she's getting more concerned.
Right.
So she called the Nome PD to see if Sonya had been arrested.
Right.
Thinking maybe that was what happened.
Maybe
and of
she
course
was drunk and they were like, no, you know.
But no, that was not the case. They hadn't seen her. So at around 5:15 on Tuesday, she finds out that she hadn't shown up for work at the hospital. Right. So at that point, she's very concerned. That's not like her.
No.
And it's just like one of those things, like even if she's going to miss a day of work, she's going to call. Exactly. Right. So Nome PD is a historically white police department in terms of the personnel that works there, the officers.
Which, if they've got a high population of indigenous, I mean, shouldn't the police force somewhat reflect the community? I mean,
should.
You would think, but okay.
I believe at this point there was maybe 1 or 2 Alaska Native officers. Now, granted, it's not a big police force.
Right, so that's...
But, just in general, Nome has been historically a white police force, just in its history.
Sure.
And they have kind of a history of not taking reports about Alaska Native women seriously, and that has to do with, like, their statistics on crimes that get reported against Native American or Alaska Native women that actually end up going on to be, like, result in arrest and prosecution. Their stats were pretty bad.
Okay.
So Timmery goes to the police department and she's trying to explain the situation because she's feeling like they're not really taking her seriously. They're like, oh, she's just out partying, that type of a thing.
Yeah. She's young. She's sowing her wild oats.
Her wild oats.
You know.
Yeah, I guess that's one way to put it.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, that's I mean, I think that any missing person should be taken seriously, unless it's like the 90th time they've done it. And,
Yeah,
that type.
yeah, and she didn't have any history of anything like that.
Right.
And it didn't seem like they took her seriously. Timmery said, finally, one of, not a coworker, but her manager at the hospital was so concerned by her doing a no-call, no-show to work that she ended up contacting the police department also.
Right.
And that was kind of what helped them take it more seriously.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean...
So, yeah, like she had a good attendance record. So,
right.
Christina and Tom, which is her sister, Sonya's sister and brother-in-law, went to... There was this guy named Kunik, who they knew had, like, a crush on Sonya.
Oh, sure.
So, Tom, the brother-in-law, went to the police department asking if they knew where Kunik's camp was. And, because he thought he wanted to, like, go talk to him, and apparently he camped in different areas.
Oh, sure.
But the police would not give him that information and basically told him they were not concerned.
Well, if this guy, I mean, wouldn't you want to at least talk to him and ask him? Like,
we'll get there.
Okay.
So then the manager, like I said, eventually calls, and that's when they actually started like a more proper investigation into her disappearance.
Okay.
So they first go talk to Timmery, because she lives with her, and they just ask her some general questions about, her mental health, if they argued, that type of thing. And they said, she was like, no, nothing like that. There was no arguing. She was not suicidal. Nothing like that at all.
Right.
So the next day, which is Wednesday, the fire department was asked to join the search, like the volunteer fire department.
Yeah.
And one of the volunteer firefighters decided to go down a road that normally people don't use, but he could tell someone had gone down the road. There were like
Recently.
tracks there.
Oh, sure.
And he unfortunately found Sonya's body.
Oh.
And she was found in a very secluded area. It was an old gold mine.
Oh.
So this was about 8:30 p.m. So she was last seen on basically Sunday night, and she was discovered on Wednesday around 8:30 p.m.
So she may have been dead for a while.
It could have been a couple days, yeah. She was naked, completely naked. Her she was actually, it was a Dredge 5 Road is what it was called.
Okay.
And her clothes were not at the scene either.
Oh.
So the Alaska Bureau...
They took her clothes?
Yeah, which is... We'll get into that as well.
Creepy.
So the Alaska Bureau of Investigation actually had to come do the processing because Nome wasn't used to processing murders, for one thing. And it actually took the Alaska Bureau of Investigation time to get there. And the guy they interviewed was joking. He said, they talk about solving these murders in the first 48 hours. He said it might take us 48 hours to get to the scene.
Right. To begin even looking at the scene.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the Nome PD was taking shifts guarding the crime scene until they could
The proper authorities could come.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and even the guy they interviewed who was from the Bureau of Investigation, he said that unfortunately it can be a good place to commit a murder for that reason.
Right, it's so remote.
Nobody's going to be, the evidence has a long time to be kind of sitting there.
Right.
So the crime lab is based out of Anchorage, which makes sense.
Yeah.
But that's about 500 roadless miles from Nome.
Oh.
So they had to fly to the scene.
Right.
Wow. So when they got there, they had like an evidence technician come and then an investigator.
Right.
So the evidence technician said there was a pool of blood by Sonya's body.
Right.
She could tell that there were tire tracks by the body that she thought were likely left by the perpetrator.
Sure.
One thing that was very significant is the treads on 3 of the tires looked different than the rest, indicating that the vehicle had 3 of one kind of a tire and 1 of another.
Okay.
So that's a very unique characteristic. Most people don't have that type of tire arrangement on their vehicle. So that's important because it could eliminate a lot of vehicles being, related to the murder.
Exactly.
Another thing was there was a paint transfer on some of the tree branches indicating a vehicle such as a truck or SUV had driven through, and then that paint had transferred onto the branches.
Oh, wow.
And it was light blue in color.
Okay.
So they could deduce they're looking for a blue vehicle or truck or SUV with mismatched tires.
Okay.
That's something.
It is.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's more than you get on some cases.
That's for sure.
So again, she was nude except for she had 1 sock on. She had bruises on her face and chest, and she had a single bullet wound to the back of her head.
Oh.
So it was clearly a homicide. There was no questions about that.
No.
So they did interview family and friends. She had no obvious enemies.
Right.
So when Timmery had gone to the police station before, they had asked her to write down a list of friends that, any acquaintances that she knew that Sonya had. She said they just told her to write a list.
Right.
And so the one person that kind of stood out was that Kunik guy who they said had a crush on her.
Right.
And he also, Kunik, when they looked at his criminal, his criminal past, he had a record of domestic violence issues with his current kind of on and off again baby mama.
Right.
Was kind of how, and he was known to kind of have a temper, so he was seen as a person of interest.
Oh, yeah.
Then the police learned...
checks a lot of boxes.
Yes. Then they learned he drives a blue truck.
Oh, that doesn't help him.
Not at all.
No.
And then, oddly, this truck had 3 of one tire and 1 of another.
Well... Things aren't looking good for Kunik.
That's very circumstantial.
Yes, that is. It is circumstantial, but it is
it's compelling.
It is compelling. You're right. Circumstantially compelling. I like that. Yes.
And I mention Kunik's real name was Daniel Angusik. Maybe saying that wrong.
They just called him Kunik.
Yeah, for some reason. Okay. And I guess Sonya was good friends with him, but she just romantically said it wasn't her type.
Right.
Sonya was 5'11".
Okay.
So seemed like he was maybe a shorter guy. Maybe that was part of the reason.
Right.
Who knows?
Right.
But they had a friendly relationship either way.
Right. They knew each other, but not like that.
But the whole thing with the tires and the paint color, the police were very suspicious. Of him.
I'd say, that.
So they did, in the meantime, they held her funeral service at her old high school in Unalakleet. She was a star basketball player there.
Oh, wow.
Her sister, it was really sad, talked about her sister did her makeup for the funeral.
Oh.
So she would look like how she looked, how she liked to have it done type of a thing.
They weren't the only people in the high school?
No. They weren't.
Okay.
I guess there was a big, a lot of people attended, given how small the town is.
Yeah.
So besides that paint transfer and those tire tracks, there was really no usable forensic evidence found at the scene. Oh. Again, the clothes were missing. There was no foreign DNA. Right. Nothing under her fingernails. The rape kit was negative.
Oh.
Just
That is tough. So no DNA?
Nothing. So just a lack of evidence in general.
Huh.
The little evidence they had, of course, did point at Kunik. So police took his truck. Yeah. And they get his truck and they find blood drops on the floorboards of his truck.
Right.
They pull a tarp out of the back of his truck. There's dried blood all over.
Oh.
And they use an agent similar to luminol, which, if you're not familiar with luminol, it shows blood.
Why didn't they just use luminol?
I think luminol is the one everyone's familiar with, but in actuality, from what I've heard, it's not the one they most commonly use.
Oh, okay.
I think they for whatever reason that's like a brand name that people are familiar with.
So then they just always say luminol, even though it might not actually be luminol.
Right.
Okay.
Like, and that's not the name of the chemical compound. It's kind of like if you think of like a medication has like Prozac is fluoxetine.
Right.
It's kind of like that.
Or Tylenol is acetaminophen.
Right.
And you might say, I'm going to have a Tylenol, and it might be an off-brand acetaminophen.
Right. It might not really be a Tylenol.
But you're calling it a Tylenol.
This is like a similar deal.
Okay.
That's how I see it
that
anyway.
Makes sense. Yes.
I'm not, an investigator or anything of that sort. I mean,
No.
I think I am. But
We both think we are. We do have some ways that we could really be.
I think, you look at like women in general, they say we're better than the FBI in certain ways. So,
there might be some truth to that. Yes.
So anyhow, back to Kunek's vehicle.
Yes.
So there's blood all over the tires.
Things are really pointing to Kunek.
He's got three rifles behind the driver's seat.
Oh.
One has blood on the butt end of the rifle.
What was he doing?
There's obvious blood on his white Adidas tennis shoes.
Okay.
So the state investigators start testing all the blood evidence, which obviously takes time. That doesn't, it's not overnight. Right. So another officer, while that testing was taking place, went to interview him.
Right.
Kunek was adamant that he had not seen Sonya in at least 2 weeks.
Okay.
He reported the day she went missing. He was 70 miles outside of Nome.
Oh.
So
did he have an alibi?
He was hunting with friends, and they could corroborate his alibi.
Okay.
One thing they noticed is he had a pretty good scratch on his back.
Ooh, okay.
He claims his baby mama inflicted the scratch.
Oh, okay.
And they did take Kunek to the hospital, like, for a full body exam with a nurse.
Yep.
And they towed his vehicle to the police station, to be inspected more thoroughly. I might have already said that.
Right.
And they tell Kunek about what they found in terms of the fact that there was the paint transfer. They had seen that similar color paint, and about the tires on his vehicle.
Right.
And he really, in terms of that, he's like, I really don't know what to tell you about that.
Yeah,
like, that's
why there are these similarities.
He's like, I don't know.
He's got to know in his head how bad this looks.
Yes, it does look really bad.
Yes.
So they ask him about the blood, because of course that should be something he should be able to attest to.
Yeah.
And he says he ran over a rabbit and that did not die.
Oh.
And so in order to like show mercy, he intentionally ran over the rabbit again.
Okay.
But then
he,
like a day later, he calls the police back and he says, actually, I remember like why I have all this blood. And he goes, I ran over a porcupine.
Oh.
And then I ended up having to shoot the porcupine. So the police are like, okay, buddy. They're like, this seems like an out there type story.
You forgot that you...
About the porcupine.
Okay.
So they're like, this has got to be the guy. Like,
right.
There's no way. But they're waiting for all the results because they have to. Mm-hmm. So about a week after Sonya's murder, her brother-in-law Tom, that we talked about a little bit earlier, he went into the Nome Police Department, and he had been going there every morning, just showing up and kind of saying, like, is there anything new?
Right.
We haven't
like
forgotten.
Family members would expect them to do.
And he's a white guy, so I think, unfortunately, given the way it is with them, or it was at the time, I should say, because this is back in 2003, I'm sure, he felt like as a white person that might have more of an effect than her native sister going down there.
Sure.
He didn't outright say that, but that was just kind of, unfortunately, the impression.
What you picked up on.
Yeah. And he said, so he goes over and he puts a picture of Sonya on the wall. He was like, I don't want you guys to forget about her. And he said the officer that happened to be there at the time just yelled at the top of his lungs at him for doing that. He said, "We just got new drywall."
Oh my gosh.
And
who cares?
he was just super angry and demanded that
Jeez.
Tom leave the police department. But he continued to go every day anyway.
Right.
But I mean, that reaction is bizarre.
That is a bizarre reaction. And I know that over time, police officers can get kind of numb.
Desensitized.
Right,
yeah.
desensitized, kind of numb, like, and you can understand that in that line of work to a point.
Right.
But that's over the top.
Well, I always say, too, like, fake it till you make it.
Right.
Like,
right.
I worked as a nurse for 12 years, and there were days where I wasn't in the mood to, like, be a certain cheerful way.
Right.
But you fake it.
You do it
anyways.
Right.
Yeah.
And these are victims' families. You have to have compassion. You
Yes.
have to. In order to do that job, you have to have some compassion.
To some extent,
you
yes.
do. Right.
But unfortunately, that's
That wasn't the case.
not always the case.
Right.
So some time passes, and they start getting results back about Kunick's truck.
Right.
All the blood on his truck comes back as animal blood.
Oh!
All of the blood.
So he
the
was
tire
telling the
tracks,
truth.
even though he has mismatched the 3 mismatched with the 1,
Yeah.
they do not match the tracks at the scene.
It
Now,
wasn't him.
another
Wow.
thing to tell you is the 1 mismatched tire. If you look at the sequence, you've got the front driver side tire, the front passenger side tire. The 1 mismatched tire actually was the same mismatched tire as the tracks.
Oh my god!
Like,
how unlucky!
So, but the tracks on his tires did not match the tracks at the scene.
Which, I mean, unlucky for him because he was a suspect, but at the same time, it really distracted from them going and looking for this other person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The paint also did not match exactly, like when they
Right.
compared it.
Right.
And they actually found the dead porcupine
Oh,
that Kunick had
jeez.
told them about.
But it's so funny that he didn't remember it right away.
Yeah.
And then he was so honest that he called back and he's like, "Hey,
Yeah.
also the porcupine."
And they actually went out and
oh.
found the porcupine in
Right.
like this vast area.
Well, I bet he was just terrified,
Well,
though,
yeah.
thinking, "Oh, they've got a lot here."
Because although,
Like-
a lot of people, like Timmery was
Terrified,
describing
yeah.
him as being like, she's like, oh, he's just a teddy bear underneath.
Right.
Like, he had some domestic issues with his girlfriend, but the girlfriend, to be fair, was violent also. Like,
Right.
she scratched him and they got into these altercations.
It
wasn't necessarily like,
relationship.
exactly. It
Yeah.
wasn't like he was like picking on this little girl. Like,
Right.
it was both of them.
They were, yeah.
It was just
toxic relationship.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he was cleared. I mean,
Okay.
essentially, that really cleared, and he was willing. He went down willingly to be looked at the hospital.
Right.
He, to me, it's like if he was hiding a murder, he wouldn't have just left all that blood on his car.
No.
you
would try to clean it up.
and
I
he
mean,
he obviously did not.
Right.
So, about a week after the murder, only 2 of the 8 Nome officers remained on Sonya's case. Those
Okay.
2 officers were Byron Redburn,
Okay.
and he had been the one to interview Kunick.
Right.
And then the other officer was a native officer named Brian. So there's Byron, and then there's Brian
Byron and
Wayavana.
Okay.
And he had initially responded to the scene.
Right.
I have here that he was the only native officer on the force. So
Okay.
that must be...
That might be the case. Yeah.
The only reason I questioned that, because later they had shown a picture of one of the other officers, and he kind of looked native to me.
Right.
But the information I have here was that this Wayavana was the only one. And he
Okay.
ends up being important in kind of cracking the case.
Okay. And I'm thinking, though, there's only so many people in this area.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yes.
Did none of these people know somebody else with this color of a truck? I mean, like, and these wheels. I mean, I just can't.
Well, yeah, we'll get into
Okay.
that. So Wayavana, like I said, there's only 2. This has only been a week since she's been murdered, and they already have only, 6 of the 8 officers are not on the case any longer.
Right.
That's how small their police force is. Like, eventually they
Tiny.
have to move on to other things.
Right. And that makes sense.
Wayavana said, I was frustrated because they had him on the night shift.
Right.
And he's like, I can't conduct witness interviews at, I can't go to
3 a.m.
like knocking on people's doors like, hey, I'd like to interview you about a murder.
Right. They're like, excuse me.
Yeah, so Way Ivana, he seemed like a cool guy. He's like in his truck smoking a cigarette, and he's this, this native guy. And he said what he decided to do, because he was like, how can I, perpetuate this case in a forward direction?
Right.
In this, being that I'm on the night shift.
Right.
So he's like, at 3 a.m. after the bar closed, because I think they kind of were busy up until that time.
Right.
He went and got the file, and he's just started looking at the file at nighttime.
Right.
Just pulling everything out. And he's like, basically, I just thought I was going to start from scratch with the file.
Yeah.
And in the case file, Way Ivana found a handwritten note that had a tip written down on it that had not been followed up on.
Oh.
He didn't know who took the tip. He didn't know when it was taken, but he thought it was worth looking into. Now, at this point, I don't know exactly how long it had been, but it was close to like a month after she had been murdered.
Oh, okay. So time's starting to pass.
Right.
Yep.
So, or no, this is actually several months after.
Oh, okay.
But
okay.
the tip was about 4 weeks after her murder was when the tip was called in.
Okay.
That's where I'm getting confused.
Oh, I see.
So
okay.
a woman
1 month later, there was a tip, and then several months later, they're doing some kind of follow-up.
The officer reviewed the file and sees this, what looks like a pretty important tip, sitting in the file, had not been looked at.
Okay.
Which he was kind of like, that's not
aback,
good.
Like,
so
why?
a woman named Florence had called the Nome Police Department, like I said, about a month after Sonya's murder.
Okay.
And she said that she had some really important information. And so the chief and Officer Way Ivana go to the Florence's house to interview her.
Right.
So Florence Habros is the woman's name, and she says the night Sonya disappeared, she and her sister were out having a smoke on the porch.
Yeah.
And they saw Sonya Ivanoff walk by.
Oh, sure.
Now, Florence's sister was acquainted with Sonya more so than she was. So she said they all kind of just waved and said hello.
Like they didn't. If you're walking by.
Right. They didn't like stop and talk, but she definitely was able to say it was her.
Yeah. Right.
And she said she noticed a vehicle, although she couldn't identify who was driving the vehicle, but it was obvious to her that the driver was watching Sonya.
Right.
And she said she sees the vehicle like disappear, so Sonya's like starting to walk further away. Right. And then she sees it like come the same vehicle come back into view like a block up the road.
Right.
And she's watching this because I think she thought it was a little strange.
Yeah.
Plus, what else are you gonna watch?
Right.
There's not much going on.
Much. Yeah.
So the vehicle essentially ends up intercepting Sonya's path.
Okay.
Like she wouldn't have been able to really avoid
the vehicle.
Right. But Florence was like, yeah, I was still close enough to hear what they were talking about, and she heard Sonya say to the driver something along the lines of like, "What's going on?" And she gets into the vehicle.
Okay, so like maybe he's offering her a ride, and she's gonna accept it because it's Nome and
right. And
maybe it's Alaska.
Maybe she knows the person.
Yeah,
right. So she sees the vehicle drive north. Now, north happens to be in the direction of Dredge 5 Road, which is where her body is eventually discovered.
Okay.
Florence said she was it bothered her enough that she actually checked what time it was.
Oh, sure.
Now, this is something I've done before.
Yeah,
Ever since I've been into true crime, I hear like a loud noise that I think.
You look at the clock.
Because like then you can say like I know for sure it was at this time.
Right.
So I get that. I feel you on that.
Yeah.
And this is only about, so it was 1:26 a.m. This is only about 30 minutes after Sonya and Timmery had parted ways that night.
Okay.
So that at the very end of the interview, Florence ends up dropping a pretty big bombshell. She said, as the vehicle is driving away, I happened to see that the vehicle had a decal on it. like a,
Right.
you know, I guess I don't know what else to call it but that. And she clearly sees that the decal says Nome Police Department on it.
No.
So that is now at this point it's been, I don't know exactly how long, but it's been, the fact that this tip wasn't followed up on earlier is not good.
No. But was there a reason it wasn't followed up on?
Well, I guess maybe not. So Florence, being a Native Alaskan woman,
Right.
the reason she hadn't really, like, even though she called in the tip, but she thought it was weird, she hadn't heard anything about it, but that's a very courageous thing to do in the first place. Like, she was taking a big risk in the first place.
Reporting that she saw
that it was a police officer. Right. Because that had not been reported, because I don't think anyone else saw them.
Right.
So Ivanoff, who, you know, tells the chief, like, immediately when he hears this, he's like, we can't handle this case anymore.
Right.
He said the state troopers need to come in and take over, and he agreed.
Right.
But it is a little telling that the officers having to tell the chief. Right. They made a point of saying, like, Officer Ivanoff felt like he had to tell the chief, like, we need to do the right thing.
Right.
And that bothered him, you know. He thought he should have been the lead on saying that.
Right.
So they did call the Alaska Bureau of Investigation to take over the case completely.
Right. And they had to.
So a man named Eric Burrows was the investigator assigned from the ABI.
Yes.
To look at the case.
Yeah.
And he said one thing that kind of made sense now that they know she was seen in a police vehicle was, we were talking about how little evidence was left at the scene.
Right.
He said, this made me think that whoever murdered Sonya was something that they call evidence aware.
Right.
So somebody that knows, you know, what they're looking for, like to take her clothes, to not leave DNA.
Right.
To maybe decide not to sexually assault her.
Right.
You know, all these things.
But then why do it at all? I mean, I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of comes into focus at the end.
Okay.
So, and he had felt that way because he had been involved in the case in the beginning.
Right.
And he had felt like the person was evidence aware even prior to them knowing it might be a police officer.
Right.
So they said, you know, priority number one, we need to identify who was driving that police cruiser that night.
Right.
So he finds out, he knew it was a Ford Expedition. He finds out that the Nome Police Department has 3 Ford Expeditions.
Oh, sure.
None of the officers had take-home vehicles.
Right.
And that the night Sonya went missing, only 2 officers were on duty that night.
Ooh.
So there was Officer Matt Owens.
Okay. And
there's Officer Stan Fescoya.
Okay.
Each officer was driving their own cruiser that night.
Right.
So going into the background of these officers, Matt Owens had been on the Nome Police Force for about 3 years.
Okay.
He was the one that when Tom, her brother-in-law, went into the police department to hang her picture on the wall, he was the one that started yelling and freaking out.
He had the fit.
Yep.
Oh.
About the drywall and all that.
Right.
They also find out, so that's a little bit telling. Like, that's not a normal reaction.
No.
And then
No, it isn't.
Stan Kaskoya also had about 3 years on the force, and he was the officer that Timmery thought was not taking her seriously.
Oh.
So neither of the not great for either of them.
Like both of them had.
So they arranged for both officers to go to Anchorage to be interviewed and polygraphed.
Right. Which makes sense.
But before the 2 officers, because obviously, like, they had to make appointments, it wasn't, like, the same day. It was a few days later that they were scheduled to go to Anchorage, and they had to have to fly. But so a day before they were scheduled to go to Anchorage, one of the 3 Nome police cruisers disappeared. So shortly after midnight on September 23rd, 2003,
It disappeared.
when one of the sergeants noticed that cruiser 321, they are marked with a number,
Yeah.
so cruiser 321 wasn't there. He radioed the other on-duty officer, Matt Owens, and asked if he knew where it was.
Right.
He said he did not. The sergeant, looked around some more, and then he called the chief, and he said, you need to send some officers to try to find this missing vehicle.
Well, yeah.
So, as all these officers are looking for this missing police vehicle, Matt Owens, who's on duty, radios that he found the cruiser in a gravel pit that happens to be very close to where Sonya's body was found, and that shortly after that they hear Owens get on the radio and yell shots fired.
What?
So of course now all the officers are rushing to that scene,
Well, yeah.
and sirens are blaring. They're coming to the scene in full force.
Right.
By the time the other officers arrive, there's nobody around except for the Officer Owens.
Right.
And he says he's standing there and he sees a man kind of just like come out of nowhere. He shoots at him twice. The man shoots at Officer Owens twice.
Yeah.
And then just runs back into the tundra.
Yeah, okay.
So, back at the station, they start interviewing Owens about this incident. And Owens says, being shot at really frightened me to the point where I was thinking about my 4-year-old son growing up without a father, and he's like, I had an epiphany that maybe being a police officer just isn't for me.
So he wants to quit being a police officer during an investigation,
right?
Where he's one of the two people who could have been a murderer.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the
Clearly
other officers,
there's a real bright thinker. I'm sorry. Even though, I don't know. Okay.
So the other officers start searching for this mystery man because at that point, they have to take it serious, but they don't find anybody.
Right.
They also found the firearm kept in the back of the police cruiser that had gone missing, was missing.
Right.
And there was broken glass so someone had someone a rock through the window of the police cruiser in the front driver's side.
Right.
And on the seat of the driver's seat of that missing police cruiser that they found, there was a envelope that was signed by Sonya's killer.
What?
Yep.
An envelope said, I don't get it.
So it was from Sonya's killer.
Oh, it said from Sonya's killer, something
Yeah.
of that nature. Okay.
So
I was gonna say, how did they know it was her killer who had the envelope? Because they actually wrote Sonya's killer on it.
Right.
Okay.
So basically, this note is trying to sorry, I had actually taken a picture of the note.
Oh.
But it's basically trying to indicate that the police cruiser could have been stolen the night of Sonya's murder, right? Because he's basically trying to say some mystery man did this.
Right. Who flew
like he
slinked off into the tundra.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what he's.
So he's trying to make a fake person who doesn't exist. He's trying to make them think that it was this person and not him. So obviously it was him. Right.
Yes. Well, I mean, we don't know that yet.
No, I guess
but
not. Innocent till proven guilty.
Yes.
But I think it feels like he's giving him a lot of proof. You know?
Oh, here, I have the note. Sorry. The note says, pigs.
Oh my gosh.
I hate cops. I hate every one of you.
Oh.
This is the actual note.
Okay.
Sonya was just a person in the wrong place at the wrong time. I did not know her. As you can see, it was easy for me to take your pig car keys right there. It was not her fault. She thought I was a pig, and she just was a person, and I just wanted to see if I could. Every one of you should be more careful. I watch every move you make. You leave me alone, and I will leave you alone. I will also shoot you in the head if you get close.
What kind of letter is that?
So
he was trying to say it was this pretend, or not, maybe not pretend at this point, this person.
You're ruining it, Laura.
I'm sorry. But this person who slinked off into the tundra wrote this anti-cop note, and
And he left it on the seat.
He left it on the seat, signed Sonya's killer. Okay.
He also put, so Sonya had like this rec center ID card to
sure.
use the pool.
Yeah.
And he put that ID card, it had Sonya's picture on it, in the envelope as like proof that he was the murderer.
So basically he took a trophy, but then he was like, I'm
giving it back.
Giving it back now. Okay.
Now they had to investigate this as if it was actually serious because they had to cover their bases.
Well, of course.
So one thing they did find out was, unfortunately, the Nome police vehicles were not kept very securely.
Oh, okay.
They would, like the keys to some of them were kind of just left in the mailboxes.
Oh.
They would leave them running like in front of places. So
like anyone could just really
kind
come
of.
and...
Like the security was not good.
Okay.
But even despite that, the Alaska Bureau of Investigator was very skeptical of this guy's story, of Owens' story.
Right. But after what they had been through with the first gentleman, what was his name?
Kunick. Yeah.
Kunick. I mean, I guess you don't know until
because
the evidence is in.
Because I'm one of those people that I think circumstantial evidence can be really powerful.
Right.
And I bothers me that people, it's seen as less than. It's always implied in, if you TV shows and articles and stuff, they always have this kind of underlying tone as if circumstantial evidence is subpar.
But I feel like it is. I feel like you need a body. You need DNA.
But you don't always...
some scientific proof.
But so then you're saying if someone's a good enough criminal that they should just be able to get away with it?
That's tough because I still feel like they could be innocent.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I guess this case was very striking.
But
that the Kunick deal, but in the end they were able to, even though the circumstantial evidence was there, they were able to pretty easily eliminate him too. So
right. But the scientific evidence came back. It wasn't him. You know what I'm saying?
No, I know. I get it.
Yeah.
It definitely kind of.
But you would have thought this is him for sure. That's it.
Yeah. The 3-tire thing was a little.
It's over.
In this, plethora of blood. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
So everybody that. The 2 witnesses that saw Sonya speaking to the driver said it seemed like she knew him in some capacity.
Right.
And they said, that likely wouldn't be the case if some stranger had stolen the vehicle.
Right.
She's not going to be like, hey, how's it going? To
right.
some strange guy.
In a police vehicle. Hey.
She wouldn't have gotten in willingly.
Right.
And, of course, Burroughs, he's the investigator, suspects this whole incident was crafted to take the heat off one or both of the on-duty officers the night of Sonya's disappearance.
Right.
So Matt Owens and Stan Pescoya, they're still scheduled to go to Anchorage on... so they're both scheduled to go to Anchorage on August 24th.
Oh, sure.
This incident with the police vehicle occurred on August 23rd.
Oh.
So
not obvious. Don't be obvious about it.
Owens claimed he was so shaken up from being shot at that instead of getting on the plane to Anchorage, he went and saw the police therapist. So he didn't get
He's like, I'm not doing this
because he had just been shot at.
Because I've just been shot at. Oh, so there's an excuse,
Yeah.
a reason.
So Piscoya sits down with the Alaska Bureau of Investigation.
Right.
He says the night of Sonya's disappearance, it was pretty busy. He said he and Owens had a domestic violence call that they both had to respond to. He said the perpetrator was very aggressive. They ended up having to pepper spray him. So he remembered the night pretty well.
Right.
He said after the incident, he went back to the Nome Police Department and did his paperwork till about 1:30, which Sonya was abducted per the witness at 1:26.
Right.
Piscoya's story was somewhat verifiable. You know, they can look at. I don't know that there were cameras at this time, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But you know, he has times writing in his reports. He could be lying about those times, but they kind of didn't think it was likely because
of the sequence of how.
Yeah, and there was the sequence, and there was no indication that he had like tried to like scribble anything out, or edit any of his notes.
Right.
As if he was like, you know, he went and killed someone and then had to go back and make it look like.
Could someone do that? Well, yeah, but
they felt like they could verify his story.
Right, to the extent that they could.
Yes.
Right. That makes sense.
But he did kind of vouch for the other Nome Police Department officers, and I think it was in part just because you don't want to think one of your own is capable of that.
Do something like that, yeah.
So 5 days later, Matt Owens he goes to sees the therapist or whatever, and he does end up going to Anchorage.
Right.
He starts going through his interview and talks about his shift that day, which kind of matches up with what Piscoya, the other officer, said.
Right.
He denies having seen or abducting Sonya. The investigators, of course, think he's lying.
Really, yeah.
So while Owens is being interviewed, Burroughs, who was the investigator, is checking out Matt Owens, like, in Nome. He's in Nome trying to find out more information about him.
Right.
Because at this point, Stan Piscoya seems like probably not him.
Right.
So he finds out that Matt Owens has a reputation kind of for not following the rules.
Okay.
He actually requested to stay on the night shift, which is a little unusual.
Well, yeah.
And that he often brought friends to
Yeah.
keep him company, and he would on unauthorized ride-alongs in his police cruiser. Owens had been spoken to on multiple occasions about not doing this anymore, but he continued to do so.
Okay.
Burroughs finds out that Owens had a reputation for picking up women, and he used his he says, this is a quote, he used his police cruiser like a dating app.
Oh.
So it was reported that he was having sex with women in his police cruiser while on duty, but by all accounts this was consensual.
Okay.
Many of these women said Owens would follow them in his patrol car while they were walking and drive ahead of them to cut them off.
Okay.
They also find out that Owens and Sonya were not complete strangers because Sonya worked the night shift at the hospital.
Oh, so okay.
So if like a patient was being admitted that had been arrested, he would see Sonya like at the admitting desk.
Right.
So they were definitely familiar with each other to some extent.
Right.
But of course Owens really downplayed it, made it seem like he barely knew her. And he made it seem like he's like, yeah, I do give people rides in my vehicle, but he's like, it's both male and female. It's, you know, just friends of mine. He's like, it's never inappropriate.
Oh.
He denies ever having sex with anyone on duty.
Oh.
So they complete the polygraphs. Stan Piscoya passes, no problem.
Well, yeah.
And Owens failed miserably.
Okay, yep.
So after they inform Matt Owens about the polygraph, his reaction was, oh shit. So
Though still not admissible in court.
They're not, but
they're saying
starting to
we
give
know
more.
You're lying because
Yeah.
this is, you know.
So they end up reading Matt
Pretty
Owens his
indicative.
rights at that point
Right.
once they find out the result. and he's continuing to deny any involvement.
Right.
He just, Matt Owens kept saying, like, he just couldn't wrap his head around the connection between him having women get into his vehicle and Sonya's murder.
Right.
He kept asking questions like, quote, "Why is my sex life part of this investigation?" or whatever, end quote. Owens was then confronted.
Because you can't have sex at work like that. You just can't.
You can't?
No.
Dang.
You cannot.
I've been doing it all wrong.
Why. Yeah, I know. Jeez.
What a concept.
Yeah, I know. You cannot be doing that. Yeah.
So Owens then was confronted about the staging of the police vehicle 321 to implicate that the vehicle was stolen and writing the note and everything. And they just basically said, like, your story on that whole incident is very unbelievable.
Right.
But at that point, they still could not file charges.
Right. There isn't enough evidence.
There's no evidence. So they did put him on, Matt Owens on administrative leave.
Oh, yeah.
His wife filed for divorce, and a messy custody battle ensued over his 4-year-old son. He starts living in a friend's spare bedroom.
Okay.
He's still the prime and only suspect.
Right.
So they start re-interviewing people, and one of the people they re-interview was Owens' soon-to-be ex-wife.
Right.
So she states on August 12th, which is the day of the homicide, or the night of the homicide, Owens called her and said that they were searching for a missing girl and that it was not looking good. She said, "I'm positive that it was the date because it happened to be Matt Owens' birthday." So he actually ended up killing her on his own birthday.
On his own birthday, jeez.
If he did it. So his ex-wife said this was around 4:30 a.m. Now here's the thing. Sonya had not even been reported missing yet.
Right.
So he's telling her about a missing girl.
And yeah, they didn't report her right away.
Right. So that is obviously new evidence.
Right.
So they learned that Owens had plans to possibly flee. So they ended up, after they got that new information from his ex-wife who was willing to testify about that, they arrested him on October 25th, 2003, finally. Sonya's family in court during the arraignment were met with extreme hostility.
From who?
Because of the sheer fact that Matt Owens was a police officer, there were a lot of people that supported him no matter what. And this is something I just real quick want to talk about. So, when you look at, like, the police issues going on nowadays, I cannot stand, you see these people with these signs in their yard that say, "I support the police," and the blue line and all that. And I get that to an extent. But it's this whole, like, if you support the police, you support all the police. Like, you even support racist police officers that abuse their power and that aren't appropriate and they don't do their job. Like, to me, supporting, like, I think the vast majority of police officers are great. Right. I'm sure that
That's how I support good police.
Right, and so this whole, like,
I do not support bad police.
Like, but that plays into this particularly because there's pretty good evidence that he did this.
And he was a bad police.
And he was a scumbag, but yet you've got a lot of people not only supporting him, but they're being hostile towards the victim's family.
Which is just...
And that type of thing is what is so hard to wrap my brain around. It's like this whole, like, I support the police. It's like, but it's not that simple. Like, there's a gray area that it's not black and white. Like, you either support the police or you don't.
Right, exactly.
It's not that cut and dry. And that bothers me so badly.
I mean, I view it the same as I do with any people. I support good people. I don't support bad
regardless of their occupation. So unfortunately, Owens had a ton of support. Mostly members of his mostly white church spoke up on his behalf. Of course, the the native people in Alaska were not shocked by this reaction, unfortunately.
Right.
He was fired. Owens was fired 2 days after his arrest.
Yeah.
So after he was finally in custody,
Right.
a ton of women came forward and said basically Owens was doing the exact opposite of his duty to protect.
Right.
Meaning, so initially, you know, the women that came forward said it was voluntary sex.
Right.
After he was arrested and they knew he couldn't hurt them,
Right.
women were coming forward saying it was not voluntary.
Right.
And that they were being sexually assaulted and raped by Owens.
Yeah.
So one woman reported that after Matt Owens had arrested her, he raped her. And he said that, verbatim said to her, "No one will believe you because I'm a white police officer and you're an Alaska Native woman."
Oh.
So, and he was kind of right, unfortunately.
Right.
Because,
that's the...
now listen to this. Some
Right.
of these women had reported their assaults to the Nome Police Department with nothing happening. It didn't get investigated.
I really hope this helped change that police department.
We'll get into that. We're almost there. Unfortunately, you know, they still didn't really have much forensic evidence.
Right.
There were no prints on the gun. They were having trouble connecting. You know, there was no... He had taken the clothes so that his DNA wasn't in there, you know, on the body or anywhere around.
Right.
So they were a little concerned about getting a conviction.
Well, yeah.
So they did find out that there's this place called Coffee Creek, and somebody had seen Matt Owens in that area.
Sure.
It's about 70 miles north of Nome.
Okay.
And he was just known to go there in general.
Sure.
And someone had seen him burning stuff there.
Oh.
So they go there. And actually, the person reported he was burning gloves that appeared to be new.
Oh.
So it's like, why are you burning
would you
brand
do
new
that?
stuff?
Yeah.
So they go there and they find this fire pit. And in the fire pit, they find like an eyelet to a shoe, which is like where you lace the shoe. And it had the Skechers logo on it.
Oh, okay.
And Sonya was wearing Skechers the night she was murdered.
So that is evidentiary.
And there was like a metal part from a bra in there.
Okay.
And then there was something that said Tilt, which was the brand of jeans Sonya was known to wear.
Yeah, so that's evidence.
So a key was found in the burn pit as well, and it happened to be a key to Matt Owens' uncle's P.O. box.
Oh.
And they ended up finding... So that's a connection to Matt Owens.
Right, to the fire and Matt Owens, and then to her with her shoes and her...
Exactly. So, what they ended up finding, because the one thing they could never really figure out was what gun he had used.
Right.
Because they couldn't really figure that out. What they ended up finding out is that it likely, he took it from the evidence room, from like another homicide.
Sure.
Okay, so they think he took this the gun from the evidence room, which would make sense because anybody can basically just go in the evidence room and take stuff and put it back.
Right.
And they ended up finding a Jennings 22 in the evidence room that could have been the murder weapon, but they weren't, you know, not necessarily definitively.
Right.
But that was like as good as it was gonna get.
Right. And that scenario makes sense.
They end up figuring out that this whole mismatched tires thing was completely unrelated to the case.
Oh.
Somebody had just gone through there with that vehicle, and it had nothing to do with anything.
Right.
And then Owens actually ended up getting bail, and he had a supervised release. He had a very aggressive defense attorney, so his trial began on January 18th, 2005. Prosecution put on nearly 70 witnesses. They called his ex-wife. They talked about the 321 vehicle, how he was unaccounted for over 5 hours of his shift. They put on the Florence Hasbro, who was the witness. All the physical evidence from Coffee Creek.
See, there was physical evidence. So.
Yeah, eventually after they found the burn pit.
Yeah.
And then the defense called a witness who said he saw Sonya speeding past him in a blue pickup, like a day after she was supposedly missing, but he wasn't very credible.
Right.
I think that he just kind of came out of nowhere.
Right.
They also had to, admit that the gun found in the evidence room is possibly was not the murder weapon, even though it was likely that it was.
Right.
So they tried to say his ex-wife had the date wrong in terms of her hearing about a missing girl, but the ex-wife was like, no, I know for a fact because it was his birthday, and that's something
right.
I would have remembered.
Right.
They also found out that Matt Owens had looked up Sonya in like the police database in the past.
That's interesting.
And he says he was just checking to see if she was of legal drinking age, which I think in Alaska at that time it was 18.
Oh, okay.
And
she was over 18.
And so that was his claim. Who knows if that's probably not true, but they have no way to really prove that or not.
Yeah.
And then he says that, they tried to say that Byron Redburn was the killer, who was the other police officer that responded to the scene, because he was mad that Owens was having an affair with his daughter, which there's no evidence that Redburn was involved. And they also tried to throw Kunick under the bus, even though he had been cleared.
Even though he's totally clear.
So they actually, the first trial, the jury deadlocked, and it was a mistrial. So the family, of course, was heartbroken. They ended up having a second trial 7 months later, and they did a change of venue because it was such a small area.
Right.
So a city called Kotzebue, which is above the Arctic Circle.
Wow.
So after the prosecution had rested their case in that second trial, they actually had some new evidence come to light. Boyavana, the police officer that initially, and the native officer that investigated that tip initially, was chatting with his neighbor.
Yeah.
And essentially they had a conversation, and he had brought up that, whatever happened about, Charlotte, who had rented a room to Owens, he's like, I had heard that she saw Sonya's gym card in his belongings while he was staying with her.
Oh.
And Boyavana's like, I never heard anything about that. So, of course, that would be really big because it connects Owens to having that card, which was involved in that incident with the vehicle.
Right.
Inside the envelope and all that.
Yes.
So Charlotte was a friend of the Owens family, and they were kind of worried she wouldn't cooperate.
Right.
So they actually had, like, undercover person call someone that Charlotte knew and trusted, someone named Dealey Blackshear.
Right.
They had him call Charlotte and say something to the effect of, like, well, I ran my big mouth and I told the police about you seeing Sonya's card to kind of see if she would admit it.
Right.
And Charlotte said, well, I thought I saw in the newspaper that the cops already had the ID. Otherwise, I was planning on, calling that in and telling them that I had seen it. Because when they got the ID from the envelope, she was like, well, they already have it.
Right.
Not really connecting the dots.
Connecting it, yeah.
So the judge allowed Charlotte to testify even though the prosecution had already rested their case.
Right.
Once she got on the stand, she denied everything because she was his friend.
Right.
However, they had the recording of her talking to Dealey Blackshear about it, so they just
she completely
did a 180 on them. Yep. But they had the taped conversation.
Right.
So that second trial, there was a guilty verdict for first-degree murder.
Well, that's... Thank goodness.
And the theory on the case is Owens likely targeted Sonya for sex.
Right.
Or he wanted to sleep with her.
Right.
Propositioned her after she got in the vehicle.
She was like,
She refused. Maybe even threatened to tell. She was very headstrong.
Right.
Like one of those people that's like doesn't.
Nope.
I don't give
Yeah.
a crap.
Right.
And unfortunately, he was not the type of person that took rejection well.
Right.
I think he was used to getting Native
his
women,
way.
especially, to
Yep.
sleep with him because they were probably scared of him.
Right.
Being a police officer, he was used to having that power.
Right.
And getting rejected by especially a Native woman,
Right.
he was like,
Nope.
not happening. So they have since gotten a new police chief. Of course, this was
good.
a long time ago.
Yes.
But the police chief now, even the current one, said he's still dealing with some mistrust related to that
Right.
homicide, even though it was back in 2003.
Yeah.
They have 460 open sexual assault cases in Nome, mostly against Alaskan Native American women.
And there's
So-
only 3,800 people.
Isn't that that's absurd?
Oh my gosh.
So now they have someone working on just those cases, and then a victim's advocate, and they have
Oh.
hired more Native police officers.
Good.
So they are working on their police force. That's one
they're
good
working.
thing that's
Okay.
come out of this.
Yep.
But I think this case really gets to the heart
But
of
I'm sorry, it's 20 years later. It should be
right.
done. Like
And
fixed.
he started in like 2018, so it's not
Wow.
that long ago.
Jeez.
So, but if you think of this as like this type of thing is
Right.
outrageous as it sounds.
Right.
It might not be like a police officer or a person of power. It doesn't even have to be a police officer is like
Right.
murdering people, but they're sexual people. I'm not saying police officers necessarily.
Right.
There probably are some, but there are so many people in positions of power that take advantage of Native American women
Right. They do.
in that way.
Right.
And that's it's a very complicated problem, but it has a lot to do with that and the fact that these cases are not being prosecuted.
Right.
And so it's one of those things you feel powerless, like what can you do? But I think obviously when it comes to anything, awareness is
Right.
like the
Key.
first step.
Right.
Like you can't solve a problem if you don't know it's a problem.
And for the record, yes, I do think some cases circumstantial evidence is all you'll ever have, but I think it has to be extremely, incredibly good circumstantial evidence. You can't just have a bunch of things. Do you know what I mean? Like
yeah, like that
just-
case
it
with
has to be
like we were just talking about
very
with the
good.
tires and the blood,
Right.
like.
That'd be a no-go because
But if there were like
the
10
science
other
came back.
things though, like
Right.
besides that,
Right.
that fit. To me, if the thing with circumstantial evidence is like you can take one thing by itself and it's not that compelling,
Right.
but when you combine it with multiple other pieces,
Right.
it can be very compelling.
It can, but I feel like there has to be at least something else, like the physical evidence,
Yeah.
like the circumstantial combined with something else that is somewhat
The objective.
objective.
Yeah.
Yes, somewhat scientific, somewhat able to be tested.
And
You know,
I agree with that, but what I have a hard time with is like there are criminals
Right.
that for whatever reason or scenes that are not handled appropriately where unfortunately they don't have that always and it's like does that mean that person because they're smart enough that they should get away with it?
Right.
That's
but-
what's hard to
Right.
it
it is hard, but at the same time, you cannot have innocent people sitting
right,
in
and I
prison.
agree. Like somebody said on another podcast I was listening to, like it's better to have 100 guilty people walking the streets than having one innocent person in prison,
Right.
or
Right. Yeah.
something to that effect.
Right.
So,
Right.
but anyways, that's our case for this week.
Yes, and we will be back at some point.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
we lead very busy lives.
Yes.
If thousands of people start listening to this, then we could make it our full-time job.
There we go.
we
That'd be
would-
fantastic.
We would come out with episodes constantly.
Yes,
So
every day.
tell a friend.
Phone a friend.
Phone a
Yep.
friend. Say you want to listen to some bleak stories.
Yes. Here are a few. Yes.
I think this is episode 10, maybe
10?
9 or 10.
Ooh.
So we're getting there.
Yep. Thank you so much,
Yep.
friends.
We will see you soonish.
Bye.
Bye bye.